Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 26th of January of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And of course, the most important updates for the previous 24 hours is coming from the South Donetsk direction. According to information we have, according to the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, on January 26th of 2025, as a result of active offensive actions by units of the 5th Guards Separate Tank Brigade of the 36th Army and the 40th Guards Marine Brigade of the Vostok Group of Forces, the settlement of Velyka Novosilka of the Donetsk People's Republic was taken by the Russians. So obviously this is the significant victory for the armed force of Russian Federation. Almost at the same time with the report from the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, the Russian sources published the video from the settlement of Velyka Novosilka. In this video we will see a lot of episodes mainly about Russian flags and Russian soldiers that were celebrating the victory for the settlement. In this video we can see two Russian soldiers that raised the Russian flags. In the next episode we can see just a standalone flag somewhere in the central part of the settlement. In another episode we can see another flag raised by the Russians. Very interesting episode took place in the vicinity of the central stadium. In this video we can see three Russian soldiers that were celebrating this glorious victory ever for the Russian army. The town of Velyka Novosilka was taken by the Russians within, let's say, probably a week or something like this. Telling the truth, the battle for Velyka Novosilka was the fastest battle since the beginning of the special military operation when talking about towns or cities that has almost the same sizes. I'll remind you that the battle for the settlement of Velyka Novosilka, more precisely the battle for the Velyka Novosilka agglomeration, started somewhere on the 10th or 11th of January of 2025, so 2 weeks ago. And by the 14th of January of 2025, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, first managed to take under control the settlement by the name of Niskuchne. So that was the first target of the Russians in this area. 2 days later, by the end of the 16th of January of 2025, the Russians managed to take under complete control the settlement of Remevka. So the village of Remevka was taken by the Russians after 2 days after the fall of the settlement of Niskuchne. That was very, very fast. When the Russians secured the southern and the southwestern flanks, the Russians began advancing from the north and the northeast and from the east. And between the 16th and the 26th of January, there was the main battle for the settlement of Velyka Novosilka. So when talking about agglomeration was taken by the Russians within 16 days. When talking about Velyka Novosilka itself, this settlement was taken by the Russians within 10 days. Before the beginning of the Russian final offensive in this area, the contingent of the armed forces of Ukraine on the territory of Velyka Novosilka was more than 1,500 soldiers. A lot of Ukrainian soldiers were captured and surrendered, of course, and they managed to save their lives, but a lot of Ukrainians, mainly from the forces of the 110th Brigade of the armed forces of Ukraine, was destroyed on the territory of the settlement. Currently, we don't know for sure the exact numbers of those the Russians managed to capture and to take as a prisoners of war. We don't know, but probably within the next several days the Russians will provide us this number, because if the Russians are not going to do this, obviously we'll get this information maybe in 10 or 20 years. The biggest battle for the Russians have finished. Now the Russians will regroup themselves, and then the Russians will try to think what to do next, because now the Russians entered the operational space and they can move in any direction they like. They can attack the settlement of Gulay-Polye from the east. The Russians can attack in the northern directions towards the Russian army that are advancing currently in the western direction with the purpose to answer the Dnipro region. The Russians have lots of options, but when talking about the Ukrainians, the situation is very difficult. They have a very huge gap in their army. They have lots of problems with supply and support. They're losing support from the western countries. They have already lost support from the United States of America. Zelensky doesn't want to to make another president elections. There is a real massacre on the streets of Ukraine when talking about the mobilization process, and everything tells us that this situation can't continue endless. This situation can't take forever. Obviously, sooner or later something is going to happen. And when talking about Ukraine, obviously now the 26th of January is the best time to start the negotiation process, because every single day will make the situation for the Ukrainians worse and worse. And maybe this is the reason why Zelensky changed his mind and started talking very interesting statements. In Kiev, for example, Zelensky today said that his decree on the impossibility of negotiations with Vladimir Putin concerns everyone except himself. I have banned any political figures in Ukraine from holding any negotiations with the Russian side. I am the leader of any negotiations, and I have banned everyone else from holding them. So you see that Zelensky started begging himself, saying that it's not about me, it's about everyone else, but I can have negotiations with Russia. He is doing this just because of one thing. Because you need to understand, it's not that Zelensky now wants to have negotiation process with Russia, or he doesn't want to have. It's not about this. The problem is that now Zelensky basically doesn't have force, doesn't have time, doesn't have power to adopt an opposite law. So when talking about the legal side, now he needs to make another law, to make the situation clear that now in Ukraine, the president of Ukraine can have negotiations with Russia. But he will not be able to do this for many reasons. According to different Nazi organizations, soldiers who support the war till the last Ukraine, and many other factors. Basically, the Ukrainians Zelensky will not even be able to adopt this law. He can be dismissed by the Russians, by anyone else. So he doesn't have time. So that's why he is trying to rush the events. He's trying to resolve everything as fast as possible. And most likely, first he will demand the Western countries and the Russians to carry out negotiations with him at his status. I'm not sure that Russia is going to accept this situation. Obviously, the Russians are interested in destroying the entire Ukraine, in splitting and cutting Ukraine in many pieces. And one of the possible approaches how the Russians can achieve this is to force and to demand the Western countries and Ukraine itself to hold elections. Without elections, Russia will never accept anything from the Ukrainian side. And the thing is that the United States of America and the Western countries will be forced to follow this, because they understand that this is their normal procedure. But if Ukraine make elections, very likely that Ukraine can stop, let's say, existing. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Khurakhove direction. During the previous 24 hours, as you can see, we have changes on the ground. The Russians managed to improve their positions, and according to information we have, the Russians managed to break through in the northern part and to answer the northeastern part of the settlement of Andreevka. Obviously, that was really unexpected, because it was very difficult to imagine how the Russians were able to move through this dense network of the fortifications without, as I understand, facing any resistance from the Ukrainian side. But we see that the Russians managed to finish this, and now the Ukrainians are in a big trouble, because the distance between the southern Russian positions and the positions in the northern part is already around 5 kilometers. This is not operational encirclement, this is not a Cauldron, but obviously the situation will develop in this way, because if the Russians continue advancing in the south with the purpose to reach the southern street of the settlement of Andreevka, this will lead to several things, and by this attack the Russians will be able to complete several goals. The first one, probably the most important, to cut the Andreevka fortified area in two. And this offensive operation, and if the Russians are able to take this territory under control, will force the Ukrainians that are currently located in the eastern part to retreat, first towards the settlement of Velyka, but for this the Ukrainians would be forced to cross at least the river of Orlova and the river of Vovcha, and only then from the settlement of Velyka the Ukrainians would be forced to move further in the western directions towards the settlement of Constantinople, which will lead to more losses, because as we know, the bridge between Constantinople and Ulakli was destroyed by by the Russians, and it not just was destroyed yesterday. The Russians were bombing and attacking this bridge almost every single day since the beginning of January. Every single pontoon bridge, every single fortified area, everything was destroyed there. And the Ukrainians don't have, let's say, possibilities to use these territories for evacuation. Another important thing is that the Russians are attacking the Ukrainian forces from the east as well. According to information we have during the previous 24 hours, the Russians haven't improved anything in this area, and most likely the Russians are attacking in this area just with the purpose to pin the Ukrainians down in the territory of Dashna and not to allow them to escape. And you know that the situation is very close to another Cauldron. You know that when talking about the South Donetsk direction, this is very difficult direction for the Ukrainians, because during the battle for Ugledar, the Russians managed to create their first Cauldron in the South Donetsk direction. And since the beginning of the battle for Ugledar, the Russians created up to 7 cauldrons until the cauldron in the village of Velyka and Novosilka. And now the Ukrainians are about to enter into another cauldron. We are talking about Andreevka fortified area cauldron. I'll remind you that there was Uspenovka cauldron, there was Khurakhove cauldron, there were several cauldrons to the north of the Khurakhove water reservoir. There was several cauldrons in the village of Velyka and Novosilka itself. So as you can see, this is a very difficult situation. Basically, they're escaping one cauldron and they're getting into another. And of course, this situation, this configuration that have been taking place for the previous 5-6 months leads this Ukraine to significant losses. And very likely that Ukrainians in defense suffer more losses, much bigger losses in comparison with the Russians. So this is the situation in this area. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation around the city of Pokrovsk. Few important statements. The Russians are moving in the west, and now we understand this. The Russians are trying to answer the Dnipro region. The Russians are moving in the northwest, and the Russians are trying to move in the northern direction with the purpose to cut the railways between the settlement of Sergeyevka and the city of Pokrovsk. And there is a place where the Russians are not moving, and the Russians are not moving in the direction of Pokrovsk. And we see this from geolocations, from different articles, and many other things. And you know that this is reasonable. You know that the Russians understand that most likely if they begin assault operation of Pokrovsk, the city would be reduced to ruins. And obviously, if Ukrainians understand that they will be forced to fall back from the settlement, of course, this is the situation that plays in their favor to destroy another possible stronghold, biggest stronghold in the Pokrovsk direction, the city of Pokrovsk itself, because without this citadel, it will be very difficult for the Russians to move further in the northwestern direction, deep inside of Ukraine. The Russians understand that for them it's better to encircle the city of Pokrovsk without damaging the city much, maybe just not more than 20%. The Russians most likely are allowed to destroy not more than 20% of Pokrovsk, because they understand and they know that for them it's better when civilians that currently left the city of Pokrovsk would return back during the next 2-3 months. They will return back, they will got their jobs, they will supply and support Russian soldiers there. So the life should return back to the city. It's not like Avdiivka, it's not like any other settlement. Pokrovsk is very important from many perspectives, and the most important perspective is moving further deep inside of the territory of Ukraine. So that's why they need this area to be populated by civilians. Now let's move further. According to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the Russians, as a result of clashes, managed to secure the settlement of Zelene. As for this area, probably this is the only area where the Russians still have some dynamic, and the main purpose of moves in this area is just to shorten the lines and to take the villages to the south of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the city of Toretsk. Today the Russian sources reported that the settlement was taken by the Russians and secured by the Russians completely. But as for geolocations on the ground, there are still some positions that might be under Ukraine control. During the day we got the video of how the Ukrainians were actively withdrawing the Russians on the territory of Toretsk, mine of Toretsk. Based on this video we have adjusted the map in Russian favor, at least in this part. But anyway, we still that they're just less than 1% of some facilities under complete Ukraine control. Maybe this upcoming night between the 26th and the 27th, the Ukrainians will lose their positions there as well, and they will be forced to fall back. But as for now, we don't know for sure. But obviously, the battle is coming to an end. And with the fall of Toretsk, most likely the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back from the settlement of Krymska, and most likely the Ukrainians will escape and abandon their positions in Dachne. And then the Russians will maintain the lines, will secure the lines, and will think what to do next when moving in the direction of Konstantinovka. As for the city of Chasiv Yar, during the previous 24 hours, we got just one video of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions on the territory of the settlement of Chasiv Yar using TOS flamethrower systems. And this video, doesn't matter. So this video that bit doesn't work. Today we have problems with the president elections in Belarus, so that's why sometimes we have some problems. Anyway, this video shows how the Russians began bombing and attacking. Yes, it works now. This video shows how the Russians were bombing and attacking the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine on the territory of the central part, and this looks like the artillery preparation before a major offensive operation in this area. Most likely tomorrow, on the night between the 26th and the 27th, the Russians will make a major attack which can lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian positions in this area. As for the Sivas direction, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything. As for the southern Kupyansk or the Liman direction, during the previous 24 hours the Ukrainians made several attempts to counter-attack the Russian units in this area. The Ukrainians were counter-attacking, and the Russians were bombing and attacking them with artillery, with FPV drones. All these videos show us that nobody is going to stop offensive or defense operation in this area. Currently there are still very heavy clashes for this complex network of the fortifications, and if Ukrainians lose these strongholds, the Russians will be able to begin advancing in the south, and this can lead to unpredictable consequences, obviously. As for the central and the northern Kupyansk direction, today we got the most important update from the settlement of Novosilka. Once again, the problems. According to information we have, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the settlement of Novosilka, and there is a video where the Russians raised the flag in the central part of the settlement, and based on this video and based on this icon in this event, we have adjusted the map in the western part of the settlement. Now let's discuss the situation in the Sudzha direction. According to information we have, the Russians began, the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours made several attempts to attack the Russian forces, but not in the Sudzha direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians were trying to attack the settlement of Tetkina with the use of several assault groups, but they were discovered by the Russians and destroyed along the border. So the events that took place in this area during the previous 24 hours tell us that most likely tomorrow the Ukrainians will start another offensive operation with the purpose to stop and to slow down the Russians in the Sudzha direction. It is very important for the Ukrainians to hold their lines in this area as long as possible. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, share my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.